Section 22 of A General History of the Pirates by Charles Johnson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Trials of the Pirates, Part 3. Robert Johnson. It appeared to the court that the prisoner was one of the 20 men in that boat of the pirates which afterwards robbed the King Solomon at an anchor near Cape Apollonia. That all pirates on this and the like service were volunteers, and he in particular had contested his going on board a second time, though out of his turn. The prisoner in his defence called for Harry Glasby, who witnessed to his being so very drunk when he first came among their crew that they were forced to hoist him out of one ship into the other with a tackle, and therefore without his consent, but had since been a trusty man and was placed to the helm in that running battle they made with the Swallow. He insisted for himself likewise on Captain Turner's affidavit of his being forced, on which others, his shipmates, had been cleared. The court, considering the partiality that might be objected in acquitting one and condemning another of the same standing, thought fit to remark it as a clear testimony of their integrity, that their care and indulgence to each man, in allowing his particular defence, was to exempt from the rigour of the law such who, it must be allowed, should have stood too promiscuously condemned, if they had not been heard upon any other fact than that of the Swallow. And herein what could better direct them than a character and behaviour from their own associates? For though a voluntary entry with the pirates may be doubtful, yet his consequent actions are not, and it is not so material how a man comes among pirates as how he acts when he is there. Guilty. George Wilson. John Sharp, master of the Elizabeth, in which ship the prisoner was passenger and fell a second time into the pirates' hands, deposes that he took the said Wilson off from Sestos on this coast, paying to the negroes for his ransom the value of £3 5s. in goods, for which he had taken a note, that he thought he had done a charitable act in this, till meeting with one Captain Canning, he was asked why he would release such a rogue as Wilson was, for that he had been a volunteer with the pirates out of John Tarleton. And when the deponent came to be a prisoner himself, he found Thomas, the brother of this John Tarleton, a prisoner with the pirates also, who was immediately on Wilson's instigation, in a most sad manner, misused and beat, and had been shot, through the fury and rage of some of those fellows, if the town side, that is Liverpool, men, had not hid him in a staysail under the bowsprit, for Moody and Harper, with their pistols cocked, searched every corner of the ship to find him, and came to this deponent's hammock, whom they had like fatally to have mistaken for Tarleton. But on his calling out they found their error, and left him with this comfortable anodyne, that he was the honest fellow who brought the doctor. At coming away, the prisoner asked about his note, whether the pirates had it or no, who, not being able readily to tell, he replied, "It's no matter, Mr. Sharp. I believe I shall hardly ever come to England to pay it." Adam Comrie, surgeon of the Elizabeth, says that although the prisoner had, on account of his indisposition and want, received many civilities from him before meeting with the pirates, he yet understood it was through his and Scudamore's means that he had been compelled among them. The prisoner was very alert and cheerful, he says, at meeting with Roberts, hailed him, told him he was glad to see him, and would come on board presently, borrowing of the deponent a clean shirt and drawers for his better appearance and reception. He signed their articles willingly, and used arguments with them to do the same, saying they should make their voyage in 8 months to Brazil, share £600 or £700 a man, and then break up. Again, when the crew came to an election of a chief surgeon, and this deponent was set up with the others, Wilson told him he hoped he should carry it from Scudamore, for that a quarter share, which they had more than others, would be worth looking after. But the deponent missed the preferment by the goodwill of the Rangers people, who in general voted for Scudamore to get rid of him, the chief surgeon being always to remain with the Commodore. It appeared likewise by the evidence of Captain John Traherne, Thomas Castell, and others, who had been taken by the pirates, and thence had opportunities of observing the prisoner's conduct, that he seemed thoroughly satisfied with that way of life, and was particularly intimate with Roberts, they often scoffing at the mention of a man of war, and saying, if they should meet with any of the turnip man's ships, they would blow up and go to hell together. Yet, setting aside these silly freaks, to recommend himself, his laziness had got him many enemies. Even Roberts told him, on the complaint of a wounded man whom he had refused to dress, that he was a double rogue, to be there a second time and threatened to cut his ears off. The evidence further assured the court from Captain Thomas Tarleton that the prisoner was taken out of his brother's ship some months before, a first time, and being forward to oblige his new company, had presently asked for the pirate's boat to fetch the medicine chest away, when the wind and current proving too hard to contend with, they were drove on shore at Cape Monserrato. The prisoner called for William Darling and Samuel Morwell, acquitted, and Nicholas Butler. William Darling deposed the first time the prisoner fell into their hands, Roberts mistook him for J. Tarleton, the master, and being informed it was the surgeon who came to represent him, then indisposed, he presently swore he should be his messmate, to which Wilson replied he hoped not, he had a wife and child, which the other laughed at, and that he had been 2 days on board before he went in that boat which was drove on shore at Cape Monserrato, and at his second coming in the Elizabeth he heard Roberts order he should be brought on board in the first boat. Samuel Morwell says that he has heard him bewail his condition while on board the pirate, and desired one Thomas to use his interest with Roberts for a discharge, saying his employ and the little fortune he had left at home would, he hoped, exempt him the further trouble of seeking his bread at sea. Nicholas Butler, who had remained with the pirates about 48 hours when they took the French ships at Whydah, deposes that in this space the prisoner addressed him in the French language several times, deploring the wretchedness and ill fortune of being confined in such company. The prisoner, desiring liberty of 2 or 3 questions, asked whether or no he had not expostulated with Roberts for a reason of his obliging surgeons to sign their articles, when heretofore they did not, whether he had not expressed himself glad of having formerly escaped from them, whether he had not said at taking the ships in Whydah Road that he should like the sport were it lawful, and whether if he had not told him, should the company discharge any surgeon, that he would insist on it as his turn. The deponent answered yes to every question separately, and farther, that he believed Scudamore had not seen Wilson when he first came and found him out of the Elizabeth. He added in his own defence that being surgeon with one John Tarleton of Liverpool, he was met a first time on this coast of Guinea by Roberts the pirate, who after a day or 2 told him to his sorrow that he was to stay there, and ordered him to fetch his chest, not medicines as asserted, which opportunity he took to make his escape, for the boat's crew happening to consist of 5 French and 1 Englishman, all as willing as himself, they agreed to push the boat on shore and trust themselves with the negroes of Cape Monserrato, hazardous not only in respect of the dangerous seas that run there, but the inhumanity of the natives who sometimes take a liking to human carcasses. Here he remained 5 months, till Thomas Tarleton, brother to his captain, chanced to put in the road for trade, to whom he represented his hardships and starving condition, but was, in an unchristian manner, both refused a release of this captivity, or so much as a small supply of biscuit and salt meat, because, as he said, he had been among the pirates. A little time after this, the master of a French ship paid a ransom for him and took him off, but by reason of a nasty leprous indisposition he had contracted by hard and bad living, was to his great misfortune set ashore at Sestos again, when Captain Sharp met him, and generously procured his release in the manner himself has related, and for which he stands infinitely obliged. That ill luck threw him a second time into the pirates' hands in this ship Elizabeth, where he met Thomas Tarleton, and thoughtlessly used some reproaches of him for his severe treatment at Monserrato, but protests without design, his words would have had so bad a consequence, for Roberts took upon him as a dispenser of justice the correction of Mr. Tarleton, beating him unmercifully, and he hopes it will be believed, contrary to any intention of his it should so happen, because as a stranger he might be supposed to have no influence, and believes there were some other motives for it. He cannot remember he expressed himself glad to see Roberts this second time, or that he dropped those expressions about Comrie as are sworn. But if immaturity of judgment had occasioned him to slip rash and inadvertent words, or that he had paid any undue compliments to Roberts, it was to ingratiate himself, as every prisoner did, for a more civil treatment, and in particular to procure his discharge, which he had been promised, and was afraid would have been revoked if such a person as Comrie did not remain there to supply his room. And of this, he said, all the gentlemen, meaning the pirates, could witness for him. He urged also his youth, in excuse for his rashness, the first time he had been with them only a month in all, and that in no military employ, but in particular the service he had done in discovering the design the pirates had to rise in their passage on board the Swallow. Guilty. but execution respited until the king's pleasure be known, because the commander of the Swallow had declared the first notice he received of this design of the pirates to rise was from him. Benjamin Jeffreys. By the depositions of Glasby and Lilburne, acquitted, against this prisoner, it appeared that his drunkenness was what at first detained him from going away in his proper ship, the Norman galley, and next morning for having been abusive in his drink, saying to the pirates there was not a man amongst them, he received for a welcome 6 lashes from every person in the ship, which disordered him for some weeks, but on recovery was made boatswain's mate, the serving of which, or any office on board a pirate, is at their own option, though elected, because others are glad to accept what brings an additional share in prize. The deponents further say that at Sierra Leone every man had more especially the means of escaping, and that this prisoner in particular neglected it and came off from that place after their ship was under sail, and going out of the river. The prisoner, in his defence, protests he was at first forced, and that the office of boatswain's mate was imposed on him, and what he would have been glad to have relinquished; that the barbarous whipping he had received from the pirates at first was for telling them that none who could get their bread in an honest way would be on such an account, and he had certainly taken the opportunity which presented at Sierra Leone of ridding himself from so distasteful a life, if there had not been 3 or 4 of the old pirates on shore at the same time, who he imagined must know of him, and would doubtless have served him the same, if not worse, than they since had done William Williams, who for such a design being delivered up by the treacherous natives, had received 2 lashes through the whole ship's company. The court observed the excuses of these pirates about want of means to escape was oftentimes as poor and evasive as their pleas of being forced at first, for here at Sierra Leone every man had his liberty on shore, and it was evident might have kept it, if he or they had so pleased, and such are further culpable who, having been introduced into the society by such uncivil methods as whipping or beating, neglect less likely means of regaining liberty. It shows strong inclinations to dishonesty, and they stand inexcusably guilty. J. Mansfield. It was proved against this prisoner by Captain Traherne and George Fenn that he was one of those volunteers who was at the attack and robbery of the company's ship, called the King Solomon, that he bullied well among them, who dared not make any reply, but was very easy with his friends who knew him, for Moody on this occasion took a large glass from him and threatened to blow his brains out, a favourite phrase with these pirates, if he muttered at it. From others acquitted it likewise appeared that he was at first a volunteer among them from an island called Dominico in the West Indies, and had to recommend himself, told them he was a deserter from the Rose, man of war, and before that had been on the highway. He was always drunk, they said, and so bad at the time they met with the Swallow that he knew nothing of the action, but came up vapouring with his cutlass after the Fortune had struck her colours, to know who would go on board the prize, and it was some time before they could persuade him into the truth of their condition. He could say little in defence of himself, acknowledged this latter part of drunkenness, a vice he says that had too great a share in ensnaring him into this course of life, and had been a greater motive with him than gold. Guilty. William Davis. William Allen deposed he knew this prisoner at Sierra Leone, belonging to the Anne galley, that he had a quarrel with and beat the mate of that ship, for which, as he said, being afraid to return to his duty, he consorted to the idle customs and ways of living among the negroes, from whom he received a wife and ungratefully sold her, one evening, for some punch to quench his thirst. After this, having put himself under the protection of Mr. Plunkett, governor there for the Royal African Company, the relations and friends of the woman applied to him for redress, who immediately surrendered the prisoner and told them he did not care if they took his head off, but the negroes, wisely judging it would not fetch so good a price, they sold him in his turn again to Signor José, a Christian black and native of that place, who expected and agreed for 2 years' service from him on consideration of what he had disbursed for the redemption of the woman. But long before the expiration of this time, Roberts came into Sierra Leone River, where the prisoner, as Signor José assured the deponent, entered a volunteer with them. The deponent further corroborates this part of the evidence, in that he being obliged to call at Cape Mount, in his passage down hither, met there with 2 deserters from Roberts' ship, who assured him of the same, and that the pirates did design to turn Davis away the next opportunity as an idle good-for-nothing fellow. From Glasby and Lilburn it was evident that every pirate, while they stayed at Sierra Leone, went on shore at discretion. That Roberts had often assured Mr. Glynn and other traders at that place that he would force nobody, and in short there was no occasion for it. In particular, the prisoner's row mate went away, and thinks he might have done the same if he had pleased. The prisoner alleged his having been detained against his will, and says that, returning with elephant's teeth for Sierra Leone, the pirate's boat pursued and brought him on board, where he was kept on account of his understanding the pilotage and navigation of that river. It was obvious to the court, not only how frivolous excuses of constraint and force were among these people at their first commencing pirates, but also it was plain to them from these two deserters met at Cape Mount, and the discretional manner they lived in at Sierra Leone, through how little difficulty several of them did, and others might, have escaped afterwards if they could but have obtained their own consents for it. Guilty. This is the substance of the trials of Robert's crew, which may suffice for others that occur in this book. The foregoing list shows by an asterisk before the names who were condemned. Those names, with a cross, were referred for trial to the Marshalsea, and all the rest were acquitted. The following pirates were executed according to their sentence, without the gates of Cape Corso Castle within the flood marks. Men's names, years of age, habitations. William Magnus, 35, Minehead. Richard Hardy, 25, Wales. David Simpson, 36, North Berwick. Christopher Moody, 28. Thomas Sutton, 23, Berwick. Valentine Ashplant, 32, Minores. Peter Devine, 42, Stepney. William Phillips, 29, Lower Shadwell. Philip Bill, 27, St. Thomas's. William Main, 28. William Mackintosh, 21, Canterbury. William Williams, 40, nigh Plymouth. Robert Hawes, 31, Yarmouth. William Petty, 30, Deptford. John Janeson, 22, nigh Lancaster. Marcus Johnson, 21, Smyrna. Robert Crowe, 44, Isle of Man. Michael Mayer, 41, Ghent. Daniel Harding, 26, Croomsbury in Somersetshire. William Fernan, 22, Somersetshire. J. Moore, 19, Mere in Wiltshire. Abraham Harper, 23, Bristol. J. Parker, 22, Winford in Dorsetshire. J. Phillips, 28, Alloway in Scotland. James Clement, 20, Jersey. Peter Skidamore, 35, Bristol. James Skirm, 44, Wales. John Walden, 24, Somersetshire. J. Stevenson, 40, Whitby. J. Mansfield, 30, Orkneys. Israel Hind, 30, Bristol. Peter Leslie, 21, Aberdeen. Charles Bunce, 26, Exeter. Robert Burton, 30, Other St. Mary's, Devonshire. Richard Harris, 45, Cornwall. Joseph Nussiter, 26, Sudbury in Devonshire. William Williams, 30, speechless at execution. Aggie Jacobson, 30, Holland. Benjamin Jeffreys, 21, Bristol. Cuthbert Goss, 21, Topsham. John Jessup, 20, Plymouth. Edward Watts, 22, Dunmore. Thomas Giles, 26, Minehead. William Wood, 27, York. Thomas Armstrong, 34, London, executed on board the Weymouth. Robert Johnson, 32, at Whydah. George Smith, 25, Wales. William Watts, 23, Ireland. James Phillips, 35, Antigua. John Coleman, 24, Wales. Robert Hayes, 20, Liverpool. William Davis, 23, Wales. The remainder of the pirates whose names are under mentioned, upon their humble petition to the court, had their sentence changed from death to 7 years' servitude, conformable to our sentence of transportation. The petition is as follows. To the Honourable, the President and Judges of the Court of Admiralty for trying of pirates, sitting at Cape Corso Castle the 20th day of April, 1722, the humble petition of Thomas Howe, Samuel Fletcher, etc., humbly showeth, that your petitioners being unhappily and unwarily drawn into that wretched and detestable crime of piracy, for which they now stand justly condemned, they most humbly pray the clemency of the court, in the mitigation of their sentence, that they may be permitted to serve the Royal African Company of England in this country for 7 years, in such a manner as the court shall think proper, that by their just punishment, being made sensible of the error of their former ways, they will for the future become faithful subjects, good servants, and useful in their stations, if it please the Almighty to prolong their lives. And your petitioners as in duty, etc. The resolution of the court was, that the petitioners have leave by this Court of Admiralty to interchange indentures with the Captain General of the Gold Coast for the Royal African Company for 7 years' servitude at any of the Royal African Company's settlements in Africa, in such a manner as he, the said Captain General, shall think proper. On Thursday, the 26th day of April, the indentures being all drawn out, according to the grant made to the petitioners by the court held on Friday the 20th of this instant, each prisoner was sent for up, signed, sealed, and exchanged them in the presence of Captain Mungo Herdman, President, James Phipps, Esquire, Mr. Edward Hyde, Mr. Charles Fanshawe, and Mr. John Atkins, Register. A copy of the indenture. The indenture of a person condemned to serve abroad for piracy, which upon the humble petition of the pirates therein mentioned, was most mercifully granted by His Imperial Majesty's Commissioners and Judges appointed to hold a Court of Admiralty for the trial of pirates at Cape Corso Castle in Africa upon condition of serving 7 years, and other conditions, are as follows, namely, this indenture made the 26th day of April, Anno Regni Regis Gorgii, Magnae Britanniae, etc., Septimo Domini Millesimo Septentesimo Viginiti Duo, between Roger Scott, late of the city of Bristol, mariner of the one part, and the Royal African Company of England, their Captain General and Commander-in-Chief for the time being on the other part, witnesseth that the said Roger Scott doth hereby covenant and agree to and with the said Royal African Company, their Captain General and Commander-in-Chief for the time being, to serve him or his lawful successors in any of the Royal African Company's settlements on the coast of Africa, from the day of the date of these presents, to the full term of 7 years, from hence next ensuing, fully to be complete and ended, there to serve in such employment as the said Captain General or his successors shall employ him, according to the custom of the country in like kind. In consideration whereof the said Captain General and Commander-in-Chief doth covenant and agree to, and with, the said Roger Scott, to find and allow him meat, drink, apparel, and lodging, according to the custom of the country. In witness whereof, the parties aforesaid to these presents have interchangeably put their hands and seals, the day and year first above written, signed, sealed, and delivered in the presence of us at Cape Corso Castle in Africa, where no stamped paper was to be had. Mungo Herdman, President, witness, John Atkins, Register, witness. In like manner was drawn out and exchanged the indentures of Thomas Howe of Barnstaple in the county of Devon, Samuel Fletcher of East Smithfield, London, John Lane of Lombard Street, London, David Littlejohn of Bristol, John King of Shadwell Parish, London, Henry Dennis of Biddeford, Hugh Harris of Corfe Castle, Devonshire, William Taylor of Bristol, Thomas Owen of Bristol, John Mitchell of Shadwell Parish, London, Joshua Lee of Liverpool, William Shoren of Wapping Parish, London, Robert Hartley of Liverpool, John Griffin of Blackwall, Middlesex, James Crombie of London, Wapping, James Greenham of Marshfield, Gloucestershire, John Horn of St. James Parish, London, John Jessup of Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, David Rice of Bristol. None of which, I hear, are now living. 2 others, namely George Wilson and Thomas Otterlaney, were respited from execution till His Majesty's pleasure should be known. The former died abroad, and the latter came home and received His Majesty's pardon. The account of the whole stands thus: acquitted, 74, executed, 52, respited, 2, to servitude, 20, to the Marshalsea, 17, killed in the Ranger, 10, killed in the Fortune, 3, died in the passage to Cape Corso, 15, died afterwards in the castle, 4, negroes in both ships, 70, total 276. I am not ignorant how acceptable the behaviour and dying words of malefactors are to the generality of our countrymen, and therefore shall deliver what occurred, worthy of notice, in the behaviour of these criminals. The first 6 that were called to execution were Magnus, Moody, Simpson, Sutton, Ashplant, and Hardy, all of them old standers and notorious offenders. When they were brought out of the hold on the parade in order to break off their fetters and fit the halters, none of them, it was observed, appeared the least dejected, unless Sutton, who spoke faint, but it was rather imputed to a flux that had seized him 2 or 3 days before than fear. A gentleman who was surgeon of the ship was so charitable at this time to offer himself in the room of an ordinary, and represented to them, as well as he was able, the heinousness of their sin, and necessity which lay on them of repentance, one particular part of which ought to be acknowledging the justice they had met with. They seemed heedless for the present, some calling for water to drink, and other applying to the soldiers for caps. But when this gentleman pressed them for an answer, they all exclaimed against the severity of the court, and were so hardened as to curse and wish the same justice might overtake all the members of it, as had been dealt to them. They were poor rogues, they said, and so hanged, while others, no less guilty in another way, escaped. When he had endeavoured to compose their minds, exhorting them to die in charity with all the world, and would have diverted them from such vain discourse by asking them their country, age, and the like, some of them answered, what was that to him? They suffered the law, and should give no account but to God. Walking to the gallows without a tear in token of sorrow for their past offences, or showing as much concern as a man would express if travelling a bad road. Nay, Simpson, at seeing a woman that he knew, said he had lain with that B 3 times, and now she was come to see him hanged. And Hardy, when his hands were tied behind him, which happened from their not being acquainted with the way of bringing malefactors to execution, observed that he had seen many a man hanged, but this way of the hands being tied behind them he was a stranger to, and never saw before in his life. I mention these 2 little instances to show how stupid and thoughtless they were of their end, and that the same abandoned and reprobate temper that had carried them through their rogueries abided with them to the last. Samuel Fletcher, another of the pirates ordered for execution but reprieved, seemed to have a quicker sense of his condition, for when he saw those he was allotted with gone to execution, he sent a message by the provost marshal to the court to be informed of the meaning of it, and humbly desired to know whether they designed him mercy or not. If they did, he stood infinitely obliged to them, and thought the whole service of his life an incompetent return for so great a favour, but that if he was to suffer, the sooner the better, he said, that he might be out of his pain. There were others of these pirates, the reverse of this, and though destitute of ministers or fit persons to represent their sins and assist them with spiritual advice, were yet always employing their time to good purposes, and behaved with a great deal of seeming devotion and penitence. Amongst these may be reckoned Scudamore, Williams, Phillips, Stevenson, Jeffreys, Leslie, Harper, Armstrong, Bunce, and others. Scudamore too lately discerned the folly and wickedness of the enterprise that had chiefly brought him under sentence of death, from which, seeing there was no hopes of escaping, he petitioned for 2 or 3 days' reprieve, which was granted, and for that time applied himself incessantly to prayer and reading the Scriptures, seemed to have a deep sense of his sins, of this in particular, and desired at the gallows they would have patience with him, to sing the first part of the 31st Psalm, which he did by himself throughout. Armstrong, having been a deserter from His Majesty's service, was executed on board the Weymouth, and the only one that was. There was no body to press him to an acknowledgment of the crime he died for, nor of sorrowing in particular for it, which would have been exemplary, and made suitable impressions on seamen, so that his last hour was spent in lamenting and bewailing his sins in general, exhorting the spectators to an honest and good life, in which alone they could find satisfaction. In the end he desired they would join with him in singing 2 or 3 latter verses of the 140th Psalm, and that being concluded he was, at the firing of a gun, tricked up at the 4-yard arm. Bunce was a young man, not above 26 years old, but made the most pathetical speech of any at the gallows. He first declaimed against the gilded baits of power, liberty, and wealth that had ensnared him among the pirates, his unexperienced years not being able to withstand the temptation, but that the briskness he had shown, which so fatally had procured him favour amongst them, was not so much a fault in principle as the liveliness and vivacity of his nature. He was now extremely afflicted for the injuries he had done to all men, and begged theirs and God's forgiveness, very earnestly exhorting the spectators to remember their Creator in their youth, and guard betimes that their minds took not a wrong bias, concluding with this apt similitude, that he stood there as a beacon upon a rock, the gallows standing on one, to warn erring mariners of danger. End of section 22. Read by Sandra in Nova Scotia, 2024.